All right, let's jump into another deep dive today. And today we're looking into the murder of Heidi Firkus in Minnesota. You sent in a bunch of audio, mainly from that 48 Hours podcast, Death at the Front Door, Who Shot Heidi Firkus? So we'll take a look at that and see what we can learn about this case together.
Yeah, Heidi and her husband Nick, they seem like just a regular couple,
Yeah.
living in St. Paul. It's kind of scary how quickly things can change.
Yeah, no. On April 25th, 2010, Heidi called 911. She was saying somebody was breaking into their home, but then just moments later, she was killed by a shotgun blast.
Yeah.
It's really sad to hear about. Actually, we have that 911 call. Let's take a listen.
Okay. That was hard to listen to. The fear in her voice it's just so real. Her husband Nick also called 911, but he sounded a lot calmer, almost too calm, I guess. And as the police started investigating his story about what happened, about the intruder, there were a lot of things that didn't make sense. One of the things that stood out right away was how different Nick's 911 call sounded compared to Heidi's. Heidi was scared. You could hear the panic in her voice. But Nick, he sounded almost like, I don't know, like he wasn't really there. His
Yeah.
voice was flat, and he didn't seem as urgent as you'd expect. And even at the funeral, people who are close to Nick said he seemed strangely composed, not really showing the kind of grief you'd expect from someone who just lost their wife in such a terrible way.
Yeah, that is strange. And then there's the whole break-in story. Who breaks into a house at 6:30 in the morning on a Sunday?
Right.
And why would Heidi be the one going downstairs towards the intruder, especially without any weapon?
It is pretty strange.
Yeah.
And Sergeant Jim Gray, one of the first officers at the crime scene, he noticed those inconsistencies right away and started to have doubts about Nick's story.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So what did they find at the scene that made them suspicious?
Well, they tried to recreate that door rattling that Nick said he heard.
Hmm.
The one he said made him think there was an intruder.
Yeah.
But when they tried it, you couldn't even hear the rattling from the bedroom where Nick said he was.
Hmm.
And there were no signs of forced entry either. No signs of a struggle. It all just pointed to something being fishy about Nick's story.
It's like he tried to make it look like a break-in, but didn't do it right.
Yeah. And then there's the financial side of things. It turns out Nick and Heidi were in deep financial trouble. They were like 22 months behind on their mortgage payments, and they were about to be evicted the next day.
Wow, that's a huge revelation. Did Heidi even know about their money problems?
That's the thing, she didn't. There's no sign that Heidi knew anything about how bad their finances were. It's not in their emails, their texts, their phone calls. It's like Nick created this whole separate reality for her where everything was fine.
That's crazy. I can't imagine keeping something that big from my partner.
Yeah. And to make things even worse, Nick made up this whole story about them being victims of identity theft. He said they lost almost $200,000, but it was all a lie. He made it up so he could keep up the appearance that they were doing okay financially, at least to Heidi.
So he wasn't just hiding their real money problems, but he invented a whole other financial crisis.
Yeah, exactly. It really makes you think he was desperate to control the situation and how people saw him, even if it meant lying to the person he supposedly loved the most. This, combined with his strange behavior after Heidi died, really raised some red flags.
It really does sound like there's more to this story.
Oh, there's definitely more. Wait till you hear what happens 5 years later. The case goes cold, and then Nick goes and remarries a woman named Rachel, and they start a family.
Wait, so he gets remarried and starts a new life while they're still investigating his first wife's murder. That's pretty bold.
It is. And during those 5 years, the police got a tip about a possible suspect, someone who looked like the sketch they had made. It seemed like a good lead, but then it turned out this suspect was already in prison when Heidi was murdered.
Another dead end. So did Nick try to help with the investigation?
Surprisingly, no. Even with all this going on, Nick showed no interest in finding who supposedly killed his wife.
Really?
Yeah. This is a big difference from Heidi's family, who were doing everything they could to find out what happened and get justice for their daughter. They even hired a private investigator, but every lead seemed to point back to Nick.
It is strange he wasn't interested in finding out what happened. You'd think he'd want to know, right?
You would think so, yeah. But as things went on, Nick's actions just made people even more suspicious.
So 5 years pass, the case goes cold, and now Nick has a new family. What happened next?
Well, that's when Detective Nicole Sipes takes over the case in 2019. She brought a fresh perspective, and she was determined to find out the truth about Heidi's death. And she starts going over all the evidence. This is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening. What did Detective Sipes find that changed the direction of the investigation?
One of the first things she did was look closely at Nick and Heidi's finances. She found out that Nick had been hiding their financial problems from Heidi. It was like he was living a double life.
It's amazing how he was able to keep that up for so long, especially with something as big as an eviction looming.
Right. And as Detective Sipes started talking to their friends and people they knew, a very clear picture of Nick started to emerge. Everyone described him as this responsible guy, like he was really good with money. It was clear he wanted people to see him that way.
So he was very worried about what other people thought of him.
Yeah, he was probably terrified that his perfect life would fall apart. He didn't want anyone to see him as a failure, especially not Heidi.
So Sipes is uncovering all this new information about Nick. Where does his new wife, Rachel, fit into all of this?
Well, this is where things get really crazy. It seems Rachel started noticing things were off, kind of like what happened to Heidi.
Uh-huh.
She started finding things that didn't add up in their finances, and she began asking Nick about it.
So she started seeing through his act, too.
Yeah, exactly. And she started to think that maybe he was capable of something much worse than she ever imagined. So she did something that would change the whole investigation.
Yeah.
She secretly recorded a conversation with him.
Whoa, okay, this is getting intense. What happened in that conversation?
Well, Rachel confronts Nick. She asks him straight up if he could lie about killing Heidi, just like he lied about everything else. And his reaction is, well, let's just listen to a bit of the recording.
Oh, wow.
That silence is deafening. I mean, what was he thinking in that moment?
Yeah.
We can't know for sure, but that silence, along with everything else Detective Sipes had found, pointed to Nick. 11 years after Heidi's death, he was finally arrested and charged with her murder.
So after all those years, it was his second wife who helped uncover the truth.
Yeah, it seems that way. That recording, along with all the other evidence they had collected, became the center of the case against Nick Firkus.
I can't wait to hear about the trial and what arguments they made. This is already such a wild story.
It is. Let's move on to the trial and break down the main arguments from both sides. You'll be surprised by some of the strategies they used and the evidence they presented.
Okay. So Nick's finally arrested after all these years, and now he's going to trial. What was the prosecution's case?
They were pretty aggressive. They argued that Nick had staged the whole burglary to cover up Heidi's murder.
Okay.
They kept bringing up those inconsistencies we talked about before, like that really short time frame between the two 911 calls, only 65 seconds, and the fact that Heidi, who wasn't armed, was the one going towards the supposed intruder. It just didn't add up.
Right. But if they didn't have any direct proof, like fingerprints or DNA, how did they convince the jury that he did it?
Well, they focused on a couple of big things. Remember how Heidi didn't know about their money problems? The prosecution said that if she had known about the eviction, she would have been packing or doing something to get ready to move, not just getting ready for work like any other day.
Yeah.
This meant she had no reason to be scared of an intruder, which made Nick's story even more suspicious.
Yeah, that makes sense. Her not knowing about the finances really blows a hole in Nick's whole story. What else did they use?
Well, remember that reenactment of the door rattling? They brought that up again, saying there's no way Nick could have heard someone at the door from the bedroom. They also pointed out there were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, like the scene was staged.
Right, right. So they're slowly picking apart his story, showing it couldn't have happened the way he said. Did they ever find the shotgun?
No, they never found it. But this is where things get interesting. The prosecution brought in an FBI expert who had created a model of the crime scene. And this model, using the angle of the shot and other evidence, showed that it would have been almost impossible for Heidi to have been shot the way Nick said if there really was an intruder. The trajectory just didn't make sense.
Hold on, so are you saying the FBI model showed that Nick's story couldn't be true?
Pretty much, yeah. It was a big moment in the trial. It gave scientific backing to the idea that Nick staged the scene and shot Heidi himself.
Wow, that's pretty strong evidence. But what about the defense? What was their strategy?
Well, they stuck to the argument that there was no direct evidence tying Nick to murder. No fingerprints, no DNA on the gun, which they never found. They also tried to cast doubt on the FBI model, saying it was based on assumptions and couldn't definitively say what happened.
So basically they were saying the prosecution's case wasn't as strong as it seemed. Did they have any other theories or suspects?
Yeah, they did bring up a few things. They pointed out that there were tool marks on the door that didn't match any tool from the house, suggesting maybe someone else was involved. They also mentioned a neighbor who said they heard another voice at this scene, maybe a third person.
That's interesting. It seems like they were trying to create reasonable doubt. What about Rachel's secret recording? Wasn't that a big part of the case?
You would think so, right? But the judge actually decided not to allow Rachel to testify and didn't let them use the recording in the trial.
Wait, why would the judge do that?
It was a complicated legal issue. Basically, there were questions about whether the recording was legal and if they could use it in court. The defense said it violated Nick's privacy, and the judge agreed.
Wow, that must have been a big setback for the prosecution.
Yeah, it definitely made things harder. Without that recording, they had to lean even more on the circumstantial evidence and the expert testimony.
So, with all that going back and forth, what did the jury decide?
Well, even without the recording, the jury only took about 12 hours to find Nick guilty of 2 counts of murder.
12 hours. That's not very long, especially for a case this complicated. It sounds like they were pretty sure he was guilty.
Yeah, they must have felt like the prosecution gave him enough to prove he did it.
What was it like when they read the verdict?
It was a very emotional moment in the courtroom. Heidi's family had been waiting for justice for over 10 years, and you could see the relief and emotion on their faces. Heidi's brother Peter gave a really powerful statement about how long and painful it had been since her death. He talked about how kind Heidi was, her laugh, how much they all missed her.
It must have been so hard for them all those years, searching for answers and wanting justice for Heidi.
Definitely. It really shows their love and determination that they never gave up. They kept Heidi's memory alive and kept pushing for the investigation to continue.
So Nick's found guilty, but did he ever admit to killing Heidi? Did he show any remorse?
Nope. Even when he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, he still insisted he was innocent. He said he was a victim of a bad investigation.
It's hard to believe that even after being found guilty, he wouldn't take responsibility for what he did.
It's a reminder that sometimes, even when justice is served, there are still unanswered questions. We might never know exactly what made Nick do such a horrible thing.
It's unsettling to think that he'll probably take those secrets to the grave with him. But at least Heidi's family finally got the justice they deserved.
Definitely. And it's important to remember that justice can look different for different people. For Heidi's family, it was about seeing Nick held accountable, but also about remembering Heidi and making sure her story was told.
This whole case has been a roller coaster. We started with a seemingly normal couple, then a shocking murder, a web of lies, a dedicated detective, and a dramatic trial.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how complicated people are and how little we can really know someone.
And it shows how important it is to pay attention to those red flags, those gut feelings that tell us something's not right.
Exactly. Sometimes, the smallest details can be the key to finding the truth. We have to trust our instincts, speak up when we think something's wrong, and support those who are fighting for justice.
Well said. We've covered a lot, but there's one big question hanging over this whole case. What was Nick's motive? Why would he go to such extremes to deceive and hurt the woman he was supposed to love?
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. If they were having money problems, why not just tell Heidi? Maybe they could have figured something out together.
Yeah, that is a really strange part of this whole thing. You'd think talking to her would be the obvious choice, right? But I think it goes back to what we were saying about Nick and how much he cared about what people thought of him.
You mean like needing to seem successful and in control?
Yeah, exactly. He probably couldn't stand the thought of looking weak or like a failure, even to his own wife. Maybe he thought she would judge him or leave him. Or maybe he was so deep in denial that he thought he could fix it all without her knowing.
So he was more worried about keeping up appearances than actually dealing with the problem. It's like he thought he could keep this perfect life going, even if it meant ruining everything in the process.
That's really sad.
Yeah, it is. Not being able to face reality, to be honest with Heidi, that's what led him down this path of lies and violence.
It makes you think about how dangerous secrets and lies can be. They don't just hurt the person keeping them, but everyone around them too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this case also makes you wonder about shame, you know? Was he so ashamed of their money problems that he felt like he couldn't tell anyone, not even Heidi?
That's a good point. There's so much pressure in our society to be successful financially that it can be really hard to admit when you're struggling.
And for someone like Nick, who seems so focused on what other people thought of him, that shame could have been really powerful, maybe even enough to make him do something terrible.
We might never know what was going through his head, but it's clear that what he did hurt a lot of people and left a lot of questions unanswered.
It's true. We can only guess. But this case is a reminder that people can have a dark side and that secrets and lies can be really destructive.
It's a lot to think about. This deep dive has really shown how important it is to talk openly and to ask for help when we need it.
I totally agree. If we can learn anything from this, it's that keeping things bottled up and pretending everything's okay can lead to really bad outcomes.
I want to encourage everyone listening to check out the 48 Hours website for this episode. They have a bunch of extra stuff there, pictures, videos, court documents that can give you even more background on this case. It's worth taking a look if you're interested in learning more.
It's a great place to go if you want a more complete understanding of the investigation and everything that happened.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive today, I'm left with this thought. What if you were on the jury? You've heard all the evidence, the arguments, but there's no clear motive. Could you have decided whether he was guilty or not?
It's a tough question. It makes you think about how our justice system works, what it takes to prove someone's guilty, and how much weight our decisions carry.
Yeah, it reminds us that even though we want clear answers, the truth can be hard to find. Sometimes we're left with uncertainty and the fact that some questions might never be fully answered.
And that might be the most unsettling thing about this whole case. It just makes you wonder.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, but thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, sometimes the most ordinary looking cases can be the ones that really make you think. Until next time.